Chapter 5. "So?" she asked later, picking up a chair and putting it upside down on top of a round table. "How did you know I was from New York?" The bar was empty, and she'd taken pity on Darryl and left the jukebox unplugged after the last customers had gone home. He was manning a big mop and bucket and humming something unfamiliar, but he stopped to answer her question. "I saw the plates on your car." "How'd you know which car was mine? The lot must have been full last night." "Saw it earlier when I was here for the interview. 3 states were represented in the lot then, and I was pretty damn sure you weren't from Texas or Oklahoma." "I am, actually." He sent her a questioning look. "From Oklahoma. Just haven't been back in a while." Before he could ask why not, she went on. "So why did you ask me where I was from if you already knew?" "Wondered if you'd tell me." "What made you wonder that?" The chairs were all up and the floor swept. She moved behind the bar, but she'd already washed the glasses, and the guys had emptied the register before going to bed. Jason had bought a place just outside of town, but the other 2 kept rooms upstairs. There wasn't a lot left to do. "Because you're hiding something." She lifted her brows and stared at him. "Is it that obvious?" "To a guy who's been in law enforcement for 15 years, yeah. Probably not to the general public, though. But I gotta tell you, you've got me curious." He swung the mop around the last dry bit of floor, bucketed it, and rolled the whole thing back toward the kitchen. "I'm not hiding," she said, "just avoiding." "But you don't want anyone to know where you are." "What makes you think that?" He shrugged. "Cop sense." "Is that a real thing?" "You tell me," he said. Then she smiled, because he was pretty good at this game, and looked him dead in the eyes. "I'll tell you what. You tell me why you hate Christmas so much, and I'll tell you what made me come down here." He blinked. "I mean, you would think a guy who won a CMA for a country Christmas song would be just about the biggest fan Santa could have, wouldn't you?" He walked right up to her, stood real close, and looked her in the eye. She shrugged and smiled a smug little smile. "See? You're not the only one with cop sense." "At least not the only one with access to the internet," he said. "But I'm flattered you were checking me out, ma'am." "I wasn't checking you out." "Yeah, you were." "Yeah, I was." She lowered her head. God, was she blushing? "How long you in town for, Sophie?" "A few more weeks, not long." "There now, that's something we have in common. I'm not here for long either." "How long?" she asked. "A few weeks." "Isn't that coincidental?" she asked, but her throat was going dry. "I'd call it more convenient." "Convenient?" He nodded. "Very. I mean, I like you. You're easy on the eyes, smart, funny, and kind of fascinating. And, while I'm not looking for anything complicated, I think I'd enjoy spending a little time with you while I'm here. And you—" He didn't finish, leaving it up to her. She said, "Well, I'm definitely not looking for anything complicated either. Or anything at all, really." But you may or may not be aware of this, but you're kind of a hottie, and you just about melted me with all those compliments, and I got the feeling they were sincere." "They were. Are." "And, since we're both only here a short time, yeah, maybe we could hang out." She shrugged. "Beats being alone for the holidays." He was quiet for a beat too long, then said, "It just might at that." "I'd like to know your story, though," she said. "I'd like to know yours, too. So why don't you let me walk you home, and we'll see how it goes." She smiled wide and said, "I'm all the way out on the other side of town. It's too far to walk. You?" "Guys rented me a room upstairs," he said. He sounded disappointed, and she thought he might have been hoping to get lucky. She hoped this was more to him than a holiday fling, and yet not too much more, because she wasn't ready for that. "How about breakfast?" she asked. "We can meet at the diner downtown. Say 8?
"Say 9,
he said. "All right, 9 it is." Sophia locked up and headed out to her car. She was feeling happier than she'd felt in a long time. The excitement of a new attraction. A new romance, even a temporary just-for-fun one, had her feeling bubbly and light on her feet, as if the butterflies in her chest were lifting her. She hopped into her car and started the engine, but before she could shift into gear, pulled out her phone and tapped the voicemail icon, expecting a message from Aunt Vidalia, who liked her to call when she was leaving the saloon, just in case. The woman had made Sophia feel like one of her own, and the 5 daughters of Vidalia Brand McIntyre had treated her like a long-lost sister. It felt good to have 6 adult women who considered her family. It felt really good. She tapped the play button on the phone and left it lying on the passenger seat. "Hello, Sophia, it's Dave Rudman." Her lawyer again. She hit the brakes and stared at the phone, holding her breath. "Thought you'd want to know the medical board's findings came in. You've been cleared. Your license is safe. Your record remains clean." "It's over," she whispered. Then she closed her hands around the steering wheel and lowered her head onto it. "It's really over." So much relief flooded her that she was limp for a minute or two. But finally she took a deep breath, lifted her head, and put the car into gear. "That's 2 things off the list, Santa," she said. And then her eyes went wider. 3! I'm sleeping at night again." She blinked and said, 4. I didn't want to be alone for the holidays, and now I won't." "Wow. You know, you've almost got me believing, Mr. Claus." She turned on the radio, tuned it to XM Holly. Mariah Carey came on, and she smiled. What if everything really was happening just the way it was supposed to? She'd been engaged to a man she didn't love, didn't even know as it turned out. And now she wasn't. She'd been restless and unfulfilled by her life. Now she was standing at the threshold of a new life. She'd been unhappy and stressed out in her work, and now she was relaxed and enjoying herself. She'd been so tense for so long she'd started believing it was her normal state. But now she was uncoiling, every day a little more, as big falls seeped into her like warm honey, soothing and sweet. She drove around the Big Bend and into the tiny downtown area. It was maybe a quarter-mile stretch of road with shops and businesses along both sides. Most of the storefronts bore green and white striped awnings, and all of them were decked out for the holidays. She couldn't drive through this area without a little rush of that Christmassy feeling welling up inside. That swelling in the chest that radiates outward like sunbeams. That feeling had been a stranger to her for so long she'd almost forgotten it. But now that it had returned, it was as familiar as coming home. Big Falls was the perfect place for her, she decided. She was sleeping at night again. What more evidence did she need? But what about her career? She didn't want to serve drinks for the rest of her life. She was a doctor. She wouldn't feel fulfilled if she wasn't using her gift. The road split in the middle, circling around the park and meeting again on the other side. The park was a big, round, grassy place with a giant pine tree all decked in lights right in the center. The lights twinkled, illuminating a rust and red pickup truck that looked like a relic from the 50s. It bore a bumper sticker that lit up when Sophia's headlights hit it. It said, "Just breathe. I've got this." Beside the text was an image of a hand making the OK sign against a cloudy blue sky. Slowly, Sophia exhaled. All the breath in her lungs just eased out of her, and the last bit of tension seemed to leave her along with it. She was sitting still in the middle of the road, gazing at the glittering tree and green park. Experimentally, she breathed in, slow and deep, and then she breathed a little deeper. Her muscles unclenched. She smiled. A few lazy snowflakes drifted down. She followed one with her eyes as it swooped to and fro, looped up and down again, and then landed on the old truck's windshield. Santa was at the wheel, grinning at her. She jumped so hard she bumped her head. Then he waved at her. She waved back and pressed on the gas. Either there was something magical but very real going on here, or she was losing it. As she circled around the park to the other side, she noticed someone sitting on the park bench in a shadowy spot where the Christmas tree lights didn't reach. His shoulders were hunched, his head down, and his face completely hidden within the dark blue hood of the sweatshirt he wore. He wasn't moving, and she wondered briefly whether he was planning to sleep there. But that was crazy. Big Falls didn't have homeless people. 20 minutes after Sophie had driven away, a pickup truck pulled into the parking lot, its headlights moving slow across the empty barroom. Darryl was still downstairs. He'd decided on an ice-cold, long-necked nightcap because he knew he wasn't going to sleep. The notion of hanging out with Sophie McIntyre had him stirred up in a way he hadn't been in a long time. And when she'd said what she had, about it being better than being alone for the holidays, he'd had a moment of revelation. As much as he'd always denied it, as much as he'd always hated to hear his friends pointing it out to him with pity in their voices, it did stink being alone during the holidays. It really did. This was going to be the most pleasant Christmas he'd spent in a long, long time. Maybe he'd try to stop being a humbug and embrace it. As he was thinking all that, the person who'd pulled in started tapping on the front door. Surprised, Darryl got up, taking his beer with him. He'd assumed it was one of the McIntyres coming by to make sure the place was all buttoned up for the night. But they'd have had a key. He went to the door and looked out just to be safe. A smiling face sporting a full, snow-white beard looked back at him. He had eyes that crinkled at the corners and plump, rosy cheeks. He wore a lined flannel jacket, red plaid. Just looking at him made Darryl smile. And then when he noticed a couple of snowflakes landing on the old man's shoulders, he smiled even more and opened up the door. "We're closed, but if I can help you with something." "I'm making a habit of showing up here outside of business hours," he said, and he chuckled softly. "I actually have something for Sophie. Do you suppose you could give it to her for me?" "Sure. I'll see her first thing in the morning." "Wonderful, wonderful. Just tell her it's to thank her for the cocoa. She'll understand." He tugged a plain white envelope, business-sized, from his pocket and handed it over. "Thank you very much, young man." "It's Darryl." "I know. Merry Christmas," he said. "If you're lucky, she'll share." He gave a wink, then he turned and headed back to his rusty old pickup truck, got in, and drove away. Darryl closed the door and eyed the envelope. Curious as hell.